The other driver in your accident picked up charges, picked up tickets. You've been summoned to court. What does it mean? What do you have to do? How does it impact your injury case? Good morning, everybody. It's your Elkton accident and injury attorney, Jobeth Bowers, coming at you right here on Monday morning, like I always do. Well, almost always do, holidays aside. Got a question that I get all the time. Well, not all the time, but in a lot of these cases, when my clients come to me to handle the injury portion of the case, they get summons to court because the other driver picked up some sort of charge related to the accident case. There's always a lot of confusion. There's a lot of confusion because that case has very little to do with the injury case. And my clients just have a ton of questions, which I understand completely, because in Maryland, there are two separate systems, so to speak, even though they all happen at the same courthouses. You've got a criminal system. Really, there's more than two, but that come into context here. A criminal system where those traffic charges are handled, or maybe the person picked up something more serious while at the scene of the accident. And then there's the civil track. In the criminal track, the traffic track, which really even has a sub track with the Motor Vehicle Association that we're not going to talk about here, people are getting potentially jail time depending on the charges, fines, and those fines go to the state, not to the victim, because when you are called in as a witness, you're exactly that. You're a witness to the occurrence. And jail time points, which really are assessed on the MVA side, but the result of what happens in traffic court will impact whether or not there are points. And then there's the civil side, which is just money. And it's an insurance company 99.999% of the time that's paying money, at least with respect to these auto accident cases. There are other civil cases in which individuals will actually have to pay the verdict. But in the context of these auto accident cases, it's an insurance company that's paying that check, not necessarily the individual that's sitting there at the defense table. They've paid for that by paying their premiums to that insurance company over the period of time in which they were insured. So how does one have to do with the other? Well, they kind of sort of don't, and they kind of sort of do. So one of the concerns that I get all of the time, which is one of the key things I want to address here, is that if you go to the criminal / traffic court as a witness and bad things don't happen to the other driver, it doesn't necessarily have any impact negatively on your injury case. There's a lot of different reasons why people don't end up pleading guilty to things, why they don't end up getting the maximum sentence for things. A lot of times these charges are there and they get something called a probation before judgment, which isn't really a guilty in most situations. And I know there's some new ones where they don't even have to necessarily plead guilty, but in most of the situations that would come into play here, they're going to plead guilty to something, and then that guilty finding is going to be put on hold. All of these things might seem like a negative. I mean, I've had people who, the clients of mine who were hit by a drunk driver, and they thought that because the drunk driver didn't have to go to jail, that it was going to make their injury case fall apart. And that's not the case. That is only a civil, or only the criminal side of things. That is punishment for the person for doing the wrong thing. It's not the money damages side of things that we deal with on the civil side. Also, sometimes state's attorney's office, and this has happened in our office recently, where a client or the state's attorney has reached out trying to get documentation, things like medical bills or deductibles that were paid and things like that. They want those because they're evidence and they're potentially part of the trial. If they are trying to really get a penalty, maybe even some jail time, depending on the charges against the other driver, the severity of the offense sometimes can be illustrated through the damages cost, whether it be property damage to a vehicle or whether it be injuries and the medical bills that come from them. That is a separate situation. And if there are outstanding medical bills, sometimes the state's attorney will seek restitution from the defendant, the charged individual, and that restitution go back to you as the injured person. Those are generally only going to be, or at least they should only be, out of pocket type of expenses, things that you physically paid. So not necessarily the whole amount of a medical bill. Look back to just last week when we were talking about how the health insurance companies, a lot of times, if you use them, will shrink that bill through negotiations and reductions. That is not your settlement or your verdict for the civil side of the case. The two have very little to do with each other, if anything at all. But if they ask for that information, cooperate with them. If you're represented by our office and you want us to facilitate the delivery of those documents, absolutely 100%. It's something that we do on a regular basis. It doesn't happen with all of these cases. Another thing, this is actually great that I kind of stumbled over that. Sometimes my clients are concerned when the at-fault driver does not pick up charges at all. So I mentioned how irrelevant it is that maybe a case got dropped or they got a probation before judgment. Well, the same amount of relevance if they don't pick up charges at all. Now, can those things be convincing in a liability decision? Can they be kind of leveraged toward that conversation? Sure, but they're not the be-all, end-all. However, I will say, if somebody goes to court having picked up one of these charges, some of the charges, if they were to plead guilty or be found guilty of, can be helpful. They can be indicative. Not all of them, not necessarily, but certain ones. It all depends. Because let's say, for example, I'm going to give you an example of where it would be completely 100% irrelevant. Okay. Driver A rear ends driver B while stopped at a red light, stop sign, whatever. The police are called. The police come to the scene. And driver A, the person who rear-ended driver B, is given a series of tickets. One of those charges, one of those citations being for either an expired tag or failure to display their registration on demand. Okay? And when they go to court, for whatever reason, there is a negotiation to which driver A agrees, I'm going to pay the fine for expired license or failure to display registration, and you're going to drop everything else. This is a common thing that happens in all sorts of these types of cases where different charges are negotiated. I'll pay this when you drop that one. We're good. Sometimes that's done for people that don't have a driving record and they want to keep it that way. There was a mistake, accidents happen, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to give you this thing that's not going to put points on your license, but of course it's still going to generate revenue for the state. And we're going to make all this other stuff go away. If somebody pleads guilty to something like that, something that is not relevant to the accident didn't happen. A didn't rear end B because his or her tags expired or because he or she couldn't find the registration. So that particular charge and that guilty, totally irrelevant to the causation of the accident, liability, or otherwise. So not every guilty is going to trigger that locked in liability, but some of them will, like, a failure to maintain speed to avoid a collision. That's one that if they plead guilty to, it's going to be very, very heavily weighed toward helping out in the liability decision. However, if they do end up in one of those situations where, let's say, that was one of the charges that got dropped, it doesn't kill your case. So the most important thing is when you hire me, when you hire my office for one of these accident cases, work through us. If the state's attorney contacts you about showing up to court, you're going to cooperate with them, but let us know. We can tell you and explain this in more depth and more specifically to your case what to expect, what to bring. We can provide most of that documentation because my office is collecting that documentation, especially the medical stuff. So that's kind of the 10-cent tour of what happens when there are charges and how they may or may not impact your case. Also, if you think you weren't at fault for an accident and you picked up charges, you may want to contact an attorney, not my office, but I can guide you to somebody who handles that kind of stuff. Because if you plead guilty to the wrong charge on that charging document, you may completely negate your ability to pursue your injury case. So it's good that before you make a decision like that, you get the proper guidance of an attorney that handles this thing. And it may be two different attorneys because some of us only do the injury stuff. Some of us only do the criminal and traffic stuff. Makes a lot of sense. It's what makes us as good as we are at what we do, is that we stay in our lane. So until next time, I hope everybody is well and safe out there. This is Attorney Bowers signing off after warning you or reminding you that if you've got questions, info@bowerslawmd.com. Make sure you mention that you want me to talk about it on the podcast, or I might just answer your question or point you in the direction of somebody who can. Otherwise, I'm going to keep it very generic like this and talk about it so that anybody facing that type of situation has a little bit of guidance there. And as always, if it's not related to accident and injury work, I'll find somebody that really knows how to answer that question and all of the topics surrounding it. I'll bring them on here like I've done many, many times before. So until next week, same time, same channel. Be well, be safe out there.